Hello, my beautiful planty people, and how are you doing today? I hope you are doing fantastically. I'm doing well. For those of you who are new here, hi, hello, welcome. My name is Nikki. This is my channel, Plants, Pots, and Whatnot. And for all of my gluttons for punishment who just keep coming back for more, thank you so much. It is amazing to see you as always. So, welcome back to 101 Wednesdays, and I know this video was supposed to be out last week, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen, so I figured I would just wait until today so that it keeps it on the same day and doesn't mess up YouTube's algorithm, although I probably already did. Anyway, I digress. Today's video is all about watering our houseplants. I think that it is probably one of the questions that I get asked about the most. I know it's one of the things that people get the most confused about. And so today we're gonna hopefully take a lot of the confusion out of how to water your houseplant and when to water your houseplant, etc. So if that sounds like something that you'd like to stick around and watch, then please stick around and watch, and let's figure this watering thing out. So besides pests, I think watering is probably one of the things that trip people up the most. And I think it's one of those things that's really just like we overthink it. We totally overthink it. Too much water, not enough water, evenly moist, dry out completely between waterings. What does it all mean, and how do I use this information to apply it to my plants? I know, it's confusing. It can definitely be confusing in the beginning until you figure out what each plant needs and when. I can't tell you how often that I personally get asked, whether it's in DMs or in the comment section, how often do you water that plant or this plant? And that kind of tells me that we need to have a better understanding of how a plant works and what different things we need to consider when we consider watering our plant. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning. So I think the first thing that you need to take into consideration is what kind of plant you have. Different plants have different care requirements, different watering requirements. And so, you know, we have the one end of the spectrum that requires, that prefers to completely dry out, to have really dry soil, which tend to be our more succulent, hardy plants. Things like succulents, cacti, ZZ plants, etc. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have plants that like to stay a little bit more moist. Things like ferns, peace lilies, etc. But it tends to be those ones in the middle where we kind of slip up. We get a little confused because the majority of plants don't like to completely dry out or stay moist all the time. So how do we know? Well, we need to take the overthinking out of the situation and just water according to that particular plant in that particular pot in those particular conditions. Sounds easy, right? It actually is. So because there's so many different types of plants and so many different types of requirements when it comes to that particular plant's watering, it's best not to actually stick to a watering schedule. Every time I hear, oh, I water this plant once a week, I kind of cringe a little bit because something inside me goes, you're probably overwatering it. Now, if you've had that particular plant for a really long time, you know exactly what it needs and when, and I'm talking like as soon as you change its pot, as soon as you change the lighting in your home, like that plant's watering needs are going to change. So that always makes me like cringe just a smidgen. Now, I will say that checking if your plants need watering about once a week is a great idea. So I wouldn't necessarily say just willy-nilly water everything once a week because that is just asking for a multitude of problems. So when I say there's so many different things that you need to consider when properly watering your plant or knowing when to water your plant, there's a lot. So let's go ahead and let's look at each individual thing that really makes a difference when you're thinking about how often you should be watering your plant and things that, you can't just say to somebody, oh, you have you have that particular alocasia, so do I. How often do you water it? You know, and expect that you're just going to be able to do the same. So the first thing we need to consider is what kind of soil it's in. We all use different types of soils. We add different amendments, possibly, or maybe you don't. So everybody's soil type is going to be different. Plants really, really need a good, airy soil. I would hazard to say, really, it doesn't matter what the plant is. It needs air in the soil. So whether you're using things like perlite or pumice or vermiculite, bark also helps. I personally tend to lean towards perlite as far as that, to get that airiness. It's very light. It doesn't hold moisture like things like vermiculite and bark do. So it doesn't give you that like false sense of security. Perlite is an excellent option. I know some people tend to lean away from it because they feel like it rises to the top of the soil. In my personal opinion and my personal experience, I don't find that's actually a thing. A couple pieces that may be nearer to the top inch or so of the soil may come to the top, but I've never actually experienced a situation where like every piece of perlite has risen to the top of the soil. So and again, that's my personal opinion. But I know a lot of growers and, you know, even uncommon plant growers that, you know, when they pot their plants, they use simple mixture of potting soil and perlite, like about a 50-50 mix, if not more perlite. And it's a great option. It's also a sustainable option, but you know, everybody has their different preferred methods. Okay, I'm getting off track here. So you need an airy soil mixture. Some plants will be okay in just a regular old bag of, you know, Miracle-Gro potting soil that you pick up from the your nursery or Walmart or wherever you get your soil from. But I never just use potting soil out of the bag because in my personal opinion, I find that it doesn't have enough amendments in it to make it what the plant actually requires. So when you're buying potting soils from the store, they tend to be really peat heavy. Not only is peat an unsustainable resource, it takes years for peat to grow, and it's really, really dense. It's far too dense. It stays moist for too long. So what I recommend when you are potting your plant or picking what soil to use, you want to, you know, get your bagged mixture or whatever. You can also even not choose to use potting soil at all. You can use like cocoa peat. So instead of actual peat from like a peat bog, it is like finely ground cocoa husk. So it almost looks exactly like peat, but it's much more sustainable. So you want to look at adding things like perlite, like pumice, like bark, and depending on which plant you have, do your research, figure that out first. You know, aeroids will tend to want a more chunky soil. Things like anthuriums and most philodendrons like a chunky mix. And then if you're looking at things like calathea, you know, you want to go with a little less. You probably wouldn't want to put bark in them, but I would definitely put perlite or, you know, one of those options in there for those types of plants. Anyway, the moral of the story is if you're buying mixes from your garden center or wherever, check it. You're likely going to need to add at least perlite to make that a much more airy mix because usually they're far too peat heavy. Okay, let's move on. So the next thing you want to do, soil tends to compact over time, especially if it doesn't have enough amendments. So you're going to need to aerate your soil. So you can aerate your soil by using like a pen or a pencil. I have this little chopstick that I actually got in a little bonsai soil kit that I bought a while back. And this thing is amazing, but you can use anything. You can use literally anything that is long and pointy. Anyways, the roots of your plant need that air. They need to be able to uptake that air in order to grow properly. So if you have a nice condensed soil mix, I shouldn't have said nice. If you have a condensed soil mix that when you water it, the water basically just sits on top, that likely means that you need to aerate your soil a little bit because the water is not going to properly flow through there, bringing water and air to your soil. So if you run into a situation like that, you know, a quick fix is to go ahead and just take one of these and just kind of poke some holes down in around your plant. And I mean, you don't need to like repot or anything like that. Although I would, if you have a really compacted soil mix like that, it's likely not airy enough. So I would recommend maybe adding some down the road when you repot it next. Now there are people that say, don't aerate your soil. You're going to mess up the roots. I'm going to have to disagree. And you kind of have to weigh your options there. So pick your poison. You could potentially, you know, maybe disrupt a few roots with this, maybe even snap one. I will tell you that's not the end of the world. It's not going to damage your plant. It's not going to inhibit its growth in any capacity. However, if your soil stays too compact, you will have problems. You're going to have problems potentially with rot, with improper root growth, slowed plant growth, etc. So in my personal opinion, I'm going to go ahead and aerate the soil. I do that a lot. I've never had any problems with it. As long as you're not like, you know, jamming things in there, you'll be fine. Go ahead and aerate your soil. And then I would say, like I said, you know, if at a later time, if your soil is doing that, it's probably too dense. So you probably want to add some amendments next time you repot. Okay, let's move along. Some other things that you need to take into consideration when you think of how often you're going to need to water your plant are things like temperature. The warmer that it is in your house, the likelihood of you watering more often is very good. Now, the one thing I will kind of go off on a tangent here and mention is so many people have this water less in the winter. People have this like seasonal plant thing, and you need to get that whole seasonal plant care completely out of your head. We are taking care of individual plants in our home. Gardening outside, yes, totally different situation. But when you're thinking about plants in your home, you need to get the seasonal out of your head. A lot of people will say, ease up on the water in the winter because your plants are growing less. Now, when we think of what people tell us, so water your plant when it needs water, when it's dry, the air in your home in the winter is typically more dry. So if you switch from, say, watering once a week in the spring and summer to all of a sudden, oh, okay, now I know it's winter, so I'm only going to water every 2 to 3 weeks, your plant's going to dry out far too much, especially if you have like baseboard heat. Baseboard heating is extremely dry. We have gas heat here and it still tends to get a little bit dry. So in all honesty, I find I usually water my plants more in the winter than I do in the spring and summer. So another thing that really affects when you're going to water your plant or how dry or how wet it stays is humidity. The higher humidity, the more moisture is going to stay in that soil, and so it won't need to be watered as often. There's also a theory that hanging plants dry out faster than plants that are sitting on a shelf. Now, in my opinion, if that is the case, and I haven't tested this theory because I don't have a whole lot of hanging plants, but I would think it's probably the whole heat rises thing. So when you have a plant that's hanging a little bit higher, the air tends to be warmer up there, so it's going to dry out more quickly. So that may be something to keep in mind as well. The pot type is also something that's going to drastically change how you water your plants. If you have plants in terracotta, which is a material that wicks moisture away from the soil, it really holds a lot of moisture and takes it out of the soil. So your plants are going to dry out much faster if your plant is in terracotta as opposed to like ceramic or plastic or something like that. Also, the size of your pot is really going to make a difference. Obviously, a larger pot holds more soil, therefore holds more water. If you have a small terracotta pot, for example, you could find yourself watering that plant every few days. Another huge factor that I'll actually be dedicating a separate entire video on is lighting. Lighting is so absolutely crucial to the overall health of the plant. Obviously, we know plants need light because that's how they photosynthesize. But there's been a lot of situations where, you know, I've seen people say like, oh, my plant's not growing. It got root rot. I only water it like once a month. I don't understand what happened. And then we see where the plant is situated and it's like 8 feet away from a window, no grow lights, and it's a peperomia. You know what I mean? Like, if the plant was getting proper lighting, you would be able to water it on a more regular schedule and that plant would grow, would thrive, and wouldn't have gotten root rot. So lighting is absolutely crucial to the overall health of the plant. We'll get into lighting. I kind of want to go off on a tangent, but I'm not going to because we'll do a whole video on lighting. But all of these things that I mentioned are things to consider when you're thinking about how to water a plant in particular, and why when you ask someone like, oh, how often do you water that? You cannot take whatever they are doing and apply it on your own because, you know, nobody's conditions are exactly the same. So how do we know when a plant's dry and we need to water it? So there's a couple different things that you can do. You can use a moisture meter like this. You can use your finger, you can lift or tip the pot. The longer that you have a particular plant, the more you're going to know about that plant and maybe how often it needs water. You're going to be able to feel that pot and over time get to know when this pot feels like this, it's usually dry. Now plants have tricked me before like that, so I always double check. I don't just rely on the weight of the pot. But it's also going to differ depending on what kind of soil you have. If you have a really chunky soil mix, your moisture meter is not going to quite read as well as it would if it was just like a basic potting mix. So keep that in mind as well. On my plants with a chunkier soil mix, I use a combination of my moisture meter and my finger. Now, the moisture meter in this regard has kind of double duty. So you stick the moisture meter down there and maybe we don't entirely trust this reading. Maybe it says it's wet, but you're not really sure because it kind of looks dry. So pull that moisture meter out. If there is soil stuck to the probes on here, then it's still got water. You don't need to water it. A lot of the time I will just use both though, and I'll check with my finger as well. Same scenario goes there. You'll be able to feel the moisture in the soil, and if you take your finger out and it has like a bunch of dirt on it, chances are pretty good you don't need to water that plant. I will say, if you're in a situation where you check a plant and you're like, oh, I don't know, does it need water? Oh, don't water it. If you're even hesitant at all, it's best to err on the side of underwatering than it is overwatering. Usually you can come back from slightly underwatering, but it gets a little bit more tricky when you're dealing with overwatering. So we've determined that your plant needs water. How do we water? What's the best way to water? There are different opinions on how to water your plant, and whatever way you choose to water it, that's fine. I have my opinion on the best way to water plants, and I will tell you what my opinion is. But so basically you have top watering and bottom watering. Those are the two basics. So when you're bottom watering a plant, it's allowing, so you're sitting the plant in some sort of container that is full of water, and it allows the plant to slowly draw the water up through the drainage hole in the pot and water the plant from the bottom. So a lot of people choose to bottom water their plant because it helps things like fungus gnats, where the top of the soil isn't getting super wet, so it's not really providing a place for those fungus gnats to breed and thrive. So if you tend to have a really nasty problem with fungus gnats, that's also an option. However, in my opinion, if you're watering properly, you won't have constantly moist soil, which is perfect for fungus gnats anyways. I don't have a fungus gnat population. I think maybe I see one every couple weeks, which, you know, that's fine. I can deal with one rather than a whole bunch flying up my nose, and I top water. So So anyway, when you're bottom watering, go ahead and stick your plant in the water. When you start to feel the top of the soil start to get a little bit damp, then go ahead and take your pot out. It's going to depend. I can't give you a time like how long that's going to take because again, there's different things to consider, your soil type, your pot size, how dry the plant was to begin with, etc., etc. Anyway, top of your soil gets slightly moist, then go ahead and take the pot out, put it back. Top watering. If you're top watering your plant, which is the method that I personally choose, the proper way that you should be watering is to water that plant completely through, let the water drain out the bottom of the pot. I'll usually take my plant to the sink. I set it in the sink and I dump a bunch of water. I let that completely drain through and then I usually give it a second round and let that completely drain through. That way I know that the water is completely getting all of the soil, all of the roots, and everything is getting watered evenly. When you're not watering evenly all the way around the pot and making sure the entire pot is getting wet, you tend to have lopsided root growth if you're simply watering on one side as opposed to the other. And we want a nice big root system. And when you're watering all the way through, you are ensuring that the bottom of the soil gets wet, and that encourages the roots to grow longer because they're reaching for the more moisture. So take that in consideration when you're watering. It's always worked for me. I mean, there are times in between where I'll go around and just give them a little top up. But really when you're considering regular watering, you really should be taking them and letting them drain all the way through. I think when I think about watering my plant, and we always try to get as close to that plant's natural environment or care that it would be receiving in the wild in our home. And plants in the wild get water from rain, which comes from the top. So that makes sense to me. And another thing that top watering does is it allows the salts and everything that build up in the soil over time to be flushed all the way through and out. Whereas bottom watering, you don't really get that. Again, my opinion. But it definitely does encourage stronger root growth when, you know, you're flushing everything all the way through. Okay. So as far as watering goes, just try to keep in mind that plants like drinks, not sips. They are more like beer chuggers than they are scotch sippers. So if you can keep that in mind, that will ensure that your plant is nice and healthy, is growing a really nice strong root system, and will probably appreciate that much more than just a little scotch sip. So I pretty much think I covered most of everything that I wanted to talk about today. I think it's just, if I can leave you with one final thought, I would say don't overthink it. Water the plant when it's dry and needs water. Now, yes, there will be different levels of moisture where some plants like calatheas start to, you know, they need a little bit more of an evenly moist soil. So I heard it, I can't remember who I heard it from. Maybe it was Daryl from Houseplant Journal. It was somebody. Anyway, they said, think of that like a sponge. So a plant that likes to stay evenly moist, think of it like a sponge. So if you wet a sponge and just leave it as is, that's wet. That is wet soil. When you're thinking of moist soil, take that sponge, wring it out so it's not dripping any longer. That is moist. So if you get a plant like calatheas, a lot of alocasias like to stay evenly moist. Think of it that way, where the soil is wrung out sponge moistness level, moisture level. Anyway, the moral of the story is don't overthink it. Water the plant when it needs water, not on a schedule, regardless of the season. Every plant's different. Do your research on your plant, figure out what that plant needs, and just get to know that particular plant. The better you get to know that plant, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to hone in on what that plant needs and when. Okay, I really hope I covered everything. I don't want you guys to stress out about watering. Is it absolutely important for the health of your plant? Absolutely. But does it need to be as difficult as some pieces of advice tend to make it. Not really. So relax. Have your plant watering day be a relaxing one. I love plant watering day. I find it really zen and relaxing. I just kind of like tune the world out, throw some music on, and just water my plants. If I've missed anything, or if there's any additional questions that you have that I didn't cover, I tried to cover as much as I could, but I tend to get like on a tangent in one way or the other and I miss things. So if I did that, I apologize. Go ahead and ask me down in the comments. I will get back to your question. If you can also reach out to me on Instagram, message me over there if you have any additional questions. Here is my Instagram account. Well, anyway, I will go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for liking and watching and commenting and subscribing. If you're not subscribed already, please consider doing so. It is a huge help to my channel and I really do appreciate it. I would like you all to have an amazing and wonderful day, night, week, month, and year. I love you all to bitty bits and I'll see you in the next video. Mwah!